Hello, we're talking about voting and campaigns in this podcast and elections. So we've already talked about the funding that interest groups can provide candidates when we were in our interest group chapter. And if you look at the 2012 presidential campaign, it was very contentious and we had a divided electorate. But the amount of money spent by both sides, Obama and Romney, was staggering and record-setting. And together, these two candidates spent well over $1 billion just to run a campaign. So any normal person might ask, why do we have to spend so much money on just a single exercise in democracy like an election? Why do we have candidates that have to spend that money in a campaign? Well, I'll give you a couple of reasons. Number one, we have candidate-centered professional campaign operations. And these operations, especially if it's a presidential election, they're nationwide. They require huge amounts of money and resources to run a campaign like that successfully. I'll talk a little bit about that later. But number two, it comes down to television. Every election now is an incredible boon in revenue for the major networks and other cable channels because the primary channel now that candidates use to get their message across is television, and television, specifically paid television ads. And the cost of airing campaign ads on television is immense. Can't be overstated. Now, modern campaigns are candidate-centered in that their main purpose is to convince the electorate that the person running for office is better than her competitors and should be elected to office. This is a contrast to other styles of democracy. We've talked about parliamentary systems in Europe before, where the person running doesn't matter as much as her party's stance on issues. Citizens in those countries have a completely different idea of campaigns. They see candidates as representatives of party ideas. They expect when those people are in office, they'll implement the ideas of the party. So it's pretty different when you compare that to how the U.S. runs campaigns. The citizens in Europe know these party platforms really well because they understand that's the most important document that they're going to use in voting. Campaigns in a place like Great Britain, for example, last only 4 to 6 weeks, much shorter than ours, and they're led by the top candidates for prime minister. In the American system, voters really aren't that familiar with their party's platform. They have a difficult time even articulating what the party they identify with stands for. They don't have great ideas about the differences between the parties. It's not unusual for Americans to claim in a survey there are no differences between the two parties. The presidential campaign typically begins a full year before the vote, sometimes even earlier. If there's a contested primary to decide which candidate will run in the general election, there are many smaller contests in the form of primaries and caucuses, so that all takes a very long time. Now there's a nominating process that comes before elections to decide who will run in those general elections. And this nominating process has evolved a lot from the early days of the democracy. You should read about that process in your book. I won't go into it in detail here, but in the modern times, we usually select candidates through primary elections. Now, there's a problem here with primary elections and voter turnout, something we talked about in the last podcast. Turnout can be extremely low for these primary elections because there's very little media attention given to them. They often occur 6 months before the general election, so no one's really caring about these elections. And in some primaries, we have what they're called closed primary rules, in which only voters who are registered with a party can vote in that party's primary. Now, why is this a problem? Well, let's say you have a very small number of Republicans in a particular county in California. Humboldt, for instance. Now, if only 25% of those Republicans bother to turn out in a primary election to decide a candidate, well, then you have a very small number of people picking that person who will run in the general campaign. It might be down to even a few hundred or a few thousand people in a congressional district who are deciding a candidate for many tens of thousands of people. These elections are called direct primaries, but we also have indirect primaries in which we vote to send delegates that eventually vote to select the nominee. You're probably familiar with the presidential primaries, which are a good example of indirect primaries because the outcome of those elections usually send delegates to the party convention who then nominate the presidential nominee. There's a lot of variations on these primary elections. They vary by state. Your book lists a few important ones. I've already mentioned the closed primary. So on the other end of that spectrum is an open primary, in which anyone, regardless of whether they register with a party or not, can vote for either a Republican nominee or a Democratic nominee, or maybe some other party's nominee, like the Libertarians. The key here is you only get to choose one party ballot. You can't vote in all of the parties, just one. In June of 2010, we adopted kind of a unique primary system here in California. It's called the top two primary. And that means that the top two candidates in a primary, regardless of their party affiliation, then become the two general election candidates. So usually you would have a Democrat versus a Republican, right, in a typical election. But with these rules, in a place like where I live, Berkeley, where there may be 92% Democratic registration, that means that you're likely to get two Democrats running against each other in the general election. They'll be the top two in the primary. The same might even apply to the congressional district that Arcata is in. Okay, let's turn to how campaigns are run in the modern era. We've talked a little about cost, and a good example of how intense and sophisticated a campaign can be seen in Figure 9.2 in your book. It outlines a basic American campaign organization. But remember, if you're talking about a presidential campaign, imagine taking this chart and multiplying it by 50 times, because you must have what are called field operations in every state of the union if you're trying to win that state. So there's a kind of campaign manager called a field director who directs operations. That includes overseeing voter contact and voter turnout. And if the state is competitive, or if you have a lot of significant electoral votes in it, that operation is going to be quite extensive. You'll have many staff members and volunteers. It gets quite busy. And let's not forget about polling, which we talked about in the last podcast. That's part of a campaign as well. These polls, especially in the last 3 months of a campaign, will have to be conducted every few days and analyzed. This could cost $60,000 to $75,000 per poll, if not more. And that gets expensive. And also imagine the sheer number of employees of a campaign this size. In 2008, near the end of the campaign, the Obama campaign was employing 5,000 people across the United States. But the greatest cost center for a campaign is definitely communication. Candidates spend an incredible amount of time and money trying to reach voters, get their message across. And often American voters who aren't paying attention, especially what we call swing voters, those voters that decide a particular election or state in a presidential election, they can be apathetic. So you'll have to spend a lot of money on direct mail, web advertisements, phone calls, emails, and especially, of course, television, as I mentioned before, which is the most expensive way to reach these voters, but sometimes the most effective. So you have what we call air wars of continual broadcasts of 30-second campaign ads to persuade voters, and that's definitely the single most expensive part of a campaign. An ad might only cost $50,000 to $100,000 to produce, but when you air the ad, you're paying television networks and stations for the airtime, just like a commercial producer would. And this airtime can cost anywhere from $3,000 to $400,000 just to run a 30-second spot. So you can do the math and figure out how much money is being spent, especially in the last few weeks of an election, of a campaign. All right, well, let's turn to campaign finance laws, or I should say the lack thereof in the United States, because this could be one of the primary reasons that campaign fundraising and spending has gone through the roof in the last decade. You guys are witnessing perhaps an incredible spike in campaign fundraising that has no end in sight. We call some of this outside spending, or spending by groups that are not associated with any candidate campaign, but they might still advocate on behalf of a favorite candidate. And it's hard to understand, every difference between these groups. They go by a number of different names that come from the tax code numbers. We might call them 527 groups or 501c4 groups. There's a whole class called Political Action Committees, or PACs. And you might have heard, if you listen to the Colbert Report, super PACs. I don't think the names are and the distinctions between them are as important as knowing that while the courts have allowed contribution limits for candidate campaigns, so for example, if you wanted to give money to Obama during a campaign, you can only give $2,600 maximum, one for the primary and one for a general election. The term we give to this is hard money, and there are contribution limits by law that you can give to a candidate. But it's important to know there's no limit on how much can be donated to those outside groups I mentioned. We do have agencies that are supposed to be regulating campaign spending. We have the Federal Election Commission, or FEC, that does this at the federal level. In California, we have the Fair Political Practices Commission, FPPC, but they're largely ineffective in limiting the amount of money because, as I said, the Supreme Court has stated that political speech, spending money on political speech, is as protected as free speech of an individual. So you have these hard money contributions. That hard money, goes straight to the candidate campaign, and you might even have to disclose who you are in a quarterly report that goes to the FEC. But many of these outside groups are shielded from having to report their donors, and this has become a real problem in transparency during campaigns because you can basically funnel money lots of different ways without and pretty anonymously. So you have hard money. The contrast to that is soft money. This is unlimited and unregulated money that individuals, corporations, or interest groups can give to the political parties. You have to do this for party-building activities, but again, all attempts to kind of regulate money. There was a particular law known as the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act in 2002, or BICRA, that was supposed to limit soft money. But the way I've heard it described is when you try to do campaign finance reform, you might plug a hole. Let's pretend it's a dam leaking lots of holes. Water's flowing, or we should say water like money is flowing through the dam. You try to plug one hole, another hole appears. You plug that hole, another hole comes. The money is going to flow either way. It just goes to different groups. Especially these outside funds that, as I said, have a lot of protection from the courts. So many of you have probably heard of the 2010 Supreme Court decision, Citizens United versus the FEC. And in this decision, basically it established that there can be no contribution limits at all to outside groups, which are sometimes called independent expenditure committees. And the quote from the Center for Responsive Politics that talks about super PACs says that these committees may raise unlimited sums of money from corporations, unions, associations, and individuals, then spend unlimited sums to overtly advocate for or against political candidates. Okay, super PACs must, however, report their donors to the FEC on a monthly or quarterly basis. That's the super PAC's choice, like a traditional PAC would do. But unlike traditional PACs, super PACs are prohibited from donating money directly to political candidates. So, yes, there are a few rules, as you can see, but to be honest, it's the enforcement of these rules is pretty lax. It's very difficult to keep the money from flowing to these super PACs, and I can only see, unless there is a change in the court's position on this, I don't see any end in sight to the flow of money to these outside groups. Okay, a few things to ponder at the end here. So we have an environment of what most people would consider gross overspending in campaigns. And it seems to be here to stay because, like I said, the U.S. Supreme Court equates political speech, or the spending of money on that speech, like television ads, with regular free speech, which we know is unconditionally protected. So my question to you is it the same case as the Westboro Baptist Church, in which many of you said, well, we dislike these people who are they're disrespecting our country, but they have to have the freedom to say what they're going to say, as long as they're within the law? Or do you think we should take action and initiate a constitutional amendment that reverses what the Supreme Court says about political speech, distinguishes it from just speech of individuals, and put some restrictions on campaign funding and spending? It comes down to whether you think this money is distracting candidates from listening to voters and distorts the tenor of campaigns. Thanks, and I'll see you next week.